334. Historical geography, economic aspects. Modest types and their distribution more diffused. The most important of these were those lithic or stone minerals which are homogeneous in structure, high rating in their quality of hardness and with good flaking properties. Of these, the best are the volcanic glasses which are found, for instance, in the volcanic regions of East Africa, particularly around the Gregory Rift Valley, and which formed the basis of the Paleolithic Chemicapsian industry for the production of long blades and various microlithic tools. Other good quality material includes the chalcedonic forms of silica, flint, chert and jasper, silicious rocks such as quartzite, and the fine-grained silica indurated rocks such as silcrete, indurated shales and tuffs. Chalcedony was used extensively in the Mesolithic bombarded industry of Zimbabwe, whilst the Essene flint and chert were particularly important on the Tunisian plateau and in Egypt, where they are believed to have been imported. Quartzites far more widespread in Africa, especially as pebbles in river channels, and form the basis of the oldest Stone Age industries referred to as the Acheulean. In places such as in the middle reaches of the Orange River in South Africa, indurated shales were used for much the same purpose as quartzite. So of rather inferior lithic property are the fine-grained amphibole rocks known as greenstone, basis and intermediate igneous rocks like basalt, dolerite and diorite, all of which provide suitable material for the manufacture of axes and adzes. They are also useful for making weapons such as throwing stones and stone arrowheads. Basalt is perhaps the most commonly used igneous rock for making stone vessels, although virtually all available rock types can be and were used. So of other igneous rocks, granites, diorite and porphyrite are also known to have been locally important. Softer rocks such as limestones were not unrepresented, and in Egypt even very soft rocks such as steatite and serpentine were used. Besides, all over Africa, clay provided the basis for a widely dispersed and highly diversified pottery industry from the Mesolithic period. The importance of minerals in the development of human technology in prehistoric times goes beyond the making of tools, weapons and vessels. It certainly includes the construction of dwelling places, for which simple mud served as important plaster. Major public buildings or monumental masonry such as the pyramids in Egypt also required large amounts of hard granitic rocks or quartzite. Minerals provided the pigment for rock paintings, some of which, in the Sahara and in southern Africa, have been remarkably preserved until today. Such pigment was obtained from grinding various kinds of rock such as hematite, manganese and kaolin, and mixing the powder with some fatty or resinous medium. But without any doubt the mineral which had the greatest significance for development in the later part of the prehistoric period in Africa is iron ore. Although modern technology with its elaborate mechanization. 2. A. Rosenfeld, 1965, page 158. 335. Methodology and African prehistory. And huge economic investment requires the use of deposits of relatively high ore content which are very localized in their occurrence. The position was less restrictive in prehistoric times. Ferruginous laterite or ferrocarite covers quite extensive areas in the grassland savannas of Africa and is typical of old upland plains over many kinds of rocks. SOME types are so rich that they formed the basis of the earliest ironworking activities on the continent. Once the technique was discovered in the continent, it spread quickly throughout it. This was in sharp contradiction from the situation with copper and tin, which were so localized in their distribution that, apart from a few prehistoric copper-using communities such as the plateau dwellers of northeastern Ethiopia and the Luba groups in the Shub, they failed to provide Africa with a widespread bronze culture. It should be recalled, however, that a copper age flourished in Mauritania 5 centuries before our era. Vegetal resources and population growth. The vegetal resources of Africa had a very direct relationship with the capacity of the continent to support an ever-increasing density of population. As already pointed out, Africa is predominantly a grassland continent with grasses of various types occupying over 50% of its total area, followed by desert occupying some 30% and forest less than 20%. In terms of human occupancy, these varied environments have had significance related to their capacity to support game animals, provide edible fruits or roots, yield material which can be used to construct tools, clothing and shelter, or furnish cultigens which can be domesticated into agricultural crops. The grassland zone was preeminently the rich game region of Africa with its wide variety of antelope, gazelle, giraffe, zebra, lion, buffalo, hartebeest, elephant, rhinoceros and hippopotamus, as well as numerous small game. It is thus no wonder that, as Clark noted, some of the earliest sites of human occupation are to be found along streams and river courses, round lakes and on the seashore in country that is today grassland, woodland savanna, Saghalien Emil Desert or desert proper. 3 such sites were generally absent from the forest zones, although with time, both the increase in man's number and the greater improvement of his hunting techniques encouraged him to occupy all kinds of country from the sea coasts to the high mountain plateaus and from what is now waterless desert well into the forest lands. It is, however, important to bear in mind that today's vegetal zones do not necessarily correspond with the situation during prehistoric times. A succession of periods of great climatic variation have marked the Sahara Desert, which was, during the early Quaternary, more humid and carried savanna-type vegetation which supported animals such as the ox, the wild-boar, warthog, antelope and hippopotamus. By contrast, the equatorial 3. J.D. Clark, 1970 c. pages 93-4. 336. Historical geography, economic aspects. Forest is believed to have experienced more arid conditions at about the same period. Contemporaneous with resources deriving from the wild game carrying capacity of different vegetal zones is the exploitation of these zones by man for edible fruits and roots. In this regard, the presence of gallery forests along river banks and grassland zones meant that Acheulean man had the advantage of fruits, seeds and nuts of both forest and savanna environments. According to Clark, many of the wild savanna fruits, nuts and plants available to the late Paleolithic Nakakuthan population in northern Zambia, such as the fruits of the mupayu and musuku, are still regularly collected and eaten by the Bantu-speaking peoples today. For WHEN the population grew such that virtually all types of environments were occupied, the range of food gathered for human consumption must have widened considerably. It is believed, for instance, that it was the greater emphasis which came to be placed on cereal grasses by food-gathering communities in the Nile Valley that anticipated the intentional planting of grain and ushered in the era of agricultural expansion which has had such decisive effect on the human occupancy of Africa. Apart from hunting and gathering, the vegetal resources were of tremendous importance in the provision of tools, clothing and shelter. Wooden tools have been well preserved in the area around the Kalambo Falls at the southern end of Lake Tanganyika. Here were found several single and double-pointed wooden implements and short, obliquely truncated sticks that probably served as digging sticks, all of which date back to the early Paleolithic period. Although elsewhere such wooden tools have not survived, there are indications that they were widely used. In the equatorial forest, for instance, the Lupin Band industrial complex of the Paleolithic period reflects the importance of woodworking in its bifacially trimmed cortex. Similarly, the presence of many heavy kinds of scrapers among the stone tools of the Nakakuthan populations of the late Paleolithic period in the woodland savannas of Zambia and Malawi suggests extensive use of wood and its byproducts, no doubt for making game fences, game stakes and traps of various kinds. Where, as in the woodland regions, large game was not so numerous that their skins could provide clothing, the barks of trees were often used. It is probable that hafted-edge ground axes such as those found in the Mwila Rocks area of northern Zambia were used to strip and prepare bark for clothing, containers and rope. Especially from the Mesolithic period onward, vegetal products began to be used in the construction of shelters in place of caves. Branches of trees, thatch or matting were used, for instance, to construct the Mesolithic windbreak whose collapsed remains were found at Wishio Springs and which dated from the middle of the 3rd millennium before our era. By the Neolithic period and especially in those areas where agriculture had been discovered, shelters made of plant material or 4. Hibbett, page 178. 337. Methodology and African Prehistory. Sometimes the plant and mud material were to increase in number and spread. They marked man's initial steps in putting unequivocally his cultural stamp on the landscape everywhere. But if the presence of such humble dwellings marked the beginnings of man's effective occupancy of the earth's surface, it was his ability to domesticate new plants out of the abundant wild species around him that ensured his eventual dominance. The GHA conditions which enabled MBN to create new cultivable species cultigens from their wild varieties remain a matter of some controversy among scholars. Controversies also shroud the assessment of Africa's contribution to this great event. In the present state of knowledge, it is generally accepted that this has not been great, certainly nothing as impressive as the contribution of Asia. More recent researches after the monumental work of Vavilov, the Russian botanist who did not consider that there was any important center of crop domestication in Africa outside the Ethiopian highlands, are starting to provide a more informed perspective on the native contribution of Africa to its stock of cultivated crops. 5. In this regard, there is no gainsaying that the savanna has been by far more important than the forest land. It was here that in the period between the 4th and the 2nd millennium before our era many of the cultivated varieties of the African indigenous crops were domesticated. Many of these cultigens were of the seed agriculture complex and were characterized by the sowing of grain as the preparation for cultivation. 6. By contrast, the few cases of domestication in the forest region belong to the viticulture complex, involving the planting of cuttings, rhizomes, tubers or shoots as the preparation for cultivation. The most important crop domesticated in this region was the Dioscoriae spp, various species of which are now cultivated. The other domesticated plant in this region is the oil palm Iliaeganensis. In spite of the limited number of domesticated crops, the discovery of cultivation implied a new productive relation between man and his biotope. In particular, it meant a certain receptiveness to innovations involving the diffusion of cultigens from other centers, and Africa has received a large number of such new crops, notably from Asia and South America. In terms of the natural vegetal resources, this declared preference for a limited number of plants both indigenous and foreign has meant not only that MBN derived sustenance from the natural environment, but also that he was now set on a path of major biotic modifications. The need to clear lands for the new crops and to suppress other plants competing with them for soil nutrient has resulted in drastic changes to the character of vegetation everywhere in Africa. Perhaps the most potent agency used by MBN for this purpose has been fire. Evidence of the use of fire by MBN in Africa dates from the later part of the Lower Paleolithic and has led to the conclusion that as far back as 60000. 5. Then. I. Vavilov, 1935. See Chapter 27 of this volume. 6. R. Porters, 1962, pages 195 to 10 in this connection. See Chapter 27 of this volume. 338. Historical Geography, Economic Aspects. Years ago MBN was regularly using fire in Africa. Initially, however, it would appear that he used it for protection, for tool making and perhaps for hunting animals through setting fire to the grass and driving them out. Once he had attained the knowledge of cultivation it was only natural that he should use the same means to remove unwanted vegetation. This burning of vegetation for purposes of cultivation had different effects on grasses and trees. Grass, especially during the dry season in the savanna zone, burns down to ground level but is not destroyed because of its underground rootstocks. Trees, on the other hand, unless protected by thick bark may be killed. Where they are not killed, they become twisted and gnarled. The implication of the introduction of fire to the natural environment has thus been that man in Africa over the ages has significantly molded the appearance of the landscape. As the frequent firing kills off the fire-tender tree species of the humid forest, conditions are created which favor the gradual extension of grassland. In West Africa, for instance, this process has been so vigorous as to create an extensive zone of derived savanna which is found locally as far south as 6 degrees N latitude. 7. Within the savanna itself, it is notable that under the impact of the annual fires the vegetation alters in character with minor features of the landscape, changing from grassland on the open plains to a more woody cover over rocky sites. Indeed, the survival of such woody growths on rocky sites has led to the suggestion that the climax vegetation over a large part of present-day grassland must have been forest. 8. Whatever the situation, the grassland regions of Africa proved of greater resource value to early MBN since not only were they easier to clear for cultivation but they were also easier to traverse. This factor of easy traversability was decisive in the peopling of the continent. Africa is par excellence the continent of large human movements, some of which are now being delineated by archaeological, ethnographical, linguistic and historical evidence. These large movements of people have been important for the rapidity of the spread of new ideas and especially of tools and techniques. Yes, so rapid sometimes is the rate of spread that it often creates great difficulties for researchers concerned with identifying the source region of the diffusion of various innovations. Easy traversability has also been a vital factor in the spatial organization of groups of people to form political entities. The grassland regions of Africa have thus been notable for providing conditions conducive to the emergence of states in Africa. Once such states possessed the means of coercion, it was natural to expect that they would seek to bring under their domination other groups with inferior organization or implements of war. Such groups, once their resistance was broken, had the option of either becoming assimilated or retreating into less accessible or hospitable areas. In short, the corollary of the emergence of states in the grassland areas has been the further dispersal of weaker, less well-organized groups into more difficult environments such. 7. W. B. Morgan and J. C. Pugh, 1969, page 210. 8. S. R. Ayer, 1963. 339. Methodology and African Prehistory. As highly broken, mountainous areas, arid wastes or heavily forested regions. The vegetable resources of Africa can thus be seen to have played a very vital role in the historical evolution of the man in Africa. Not only have they provided MN with an abundant supply of fruits and roots, but they have enabled him to create crops which can be nurtured and protected to provide him with new and richer sources of sustenance. The increase in food supplies facilitated the steady growth of African population. UP to 1650. The continent, according to Carl Saunders, was only less populous than Asia, its population of 100 million representing over 20% of the world total. 9. An important factor in the growth of population was the greater security offered by the better organized socio-political entities. Because of their greater distribution within the savanna zone, it is easy to appreciate why this zone probably accounted for a large proportion of the continent's population at this time, a fact which, especially in West Africa, came to be gradually reversed with slave trading and the eventual foreign colonization of the continent from the 16th century onwards. Animal resources and cultural diversification closely related to the vegetable resources is the pattern of distribution of the animal resources. Africa has attracted attention from as far back as records go as the continent with large mammalian resources. Indeed, it is claimed that, excluding bats, the African mammalians consist of as many as 38 families. The distribution of these animals over the continent has varied both in time and space. Fossil remains indicate that all regions of the continent carried at one time or the other an assortment of even the larger wildlife. The North African Mediterranean region, for instance, was the home of animals such as the lion and the elephant, many of which were believed to have been driven out in the periods of great aridity during the Pleistocene. Most of those left behind were overexploited in our era to meet, for instance, the large demands of Roman amphitheaters. Indeed, as late as the middle of the 19th century, the army of the French Douai discovered great numbers of wild animals, including lions, wherever they went in Algeria, from the precipitous rocks of Constantine to the plains of Oran. The desert still preserves a remarkable range of wildlife. These include the Dorcas and Dama gazelle, the Adax, the scimitar horned oryx or Oryx algazel. In much earlier and weather times, its resources are known to have been more considerable and to have included animals such as the elephant, rhinoceros, hippopotamus, giraffe, the now extinct giant buffalo, and many of the larger antelopes. But it is the grassland plains of Africa which are the true home of the 9. A.M. Carl Saunders, 1964. At the present time, the population of Africa represents barely 10% of the world total. 340. Historical geography, economic aspects. Majority of African game. Degrees within these zones in West, East, Central and Southern Africa are found beasts of prey such as the lion, the leopard, the African tiger cat and the hyena. It is here also that we find the bugle heart beasts, the topi, the red-fronted gazelle, the warthog, the roan antelope, the zebra, the giraffe and the ostrich. Here is the natural habitat of the elephant, the buffalo and the black rhinoceros as well as of the Derby and Cape eland, the bushbuck, waterbuck and reedbuck. The extent of territory covered by each of these has changed over the centuries. All of the animals have suffered great depredations at the hands of man or have lost to other species in the great competition for survival as environmental conditions changed. The absence of the white rhinoceros between the Zambezi and the Upper White Nile, for instance, is ascribed to the competitive advantage which the change in climate and vegetation during the Pleistocene gave to the more aggressive black rhinoceros. Although most of the wild game frequent the forest of tropical Africa, this region is on the whole less endowed with animal resources. Some of the more notable forest animals include the bush pig, the giant forest hog, the bongo, the great apes such as the gorilla and chimpanzee, and the okapi. Even here environmental changes have affected the extent of the territories available earlier. The intermittent presence of the bongo is due to the reduction of what must once have been a continuous forest cover across equatorial Africa. These abundant animal resources certainly served man over the long period of his existence as primarily a hunter. So inexhaustible did these resources appear that some African communities have remained in this hunting stage of development right up to the present day. A special category of animal resources is represented by fish, which have also been caught from as far back as the Mesolithic. Not only the rivers but also freshwater lakes such as Turkana, Rudolph Nakaru and Edward in East Africa and the Chad in West Africa attracted early human population because of their fish resources. One of the rivers, the Nile, was obviously of special importance. Here were found waterside communities who used harpoons and fish hooks of bone and, in addition, hunted and ate the hippopotamus and the crocodile. The use of simple dugout canoes for fishing in inland waters is still pervasive throughout Africa. Only a few fishing communities, however, developed canoes large enough to attempt coastal sea fishing. Everywhere until recently, inadequate technological development prevented the exploitation of the rich fish resources in the sea around the continent. The singular richness of variety among land animals, however, provided a tremendous reserve of potential domesticates. Domestication of animals in Africa was virtually limited to the ass, the cat, the guinea fowl, the sheep and the cow. The reason for this state of affairs is that Africa. Ohio. F. Sommer, 1953, page 64. In this connection, see Chapter 20 of this volume. 11. Cf. Putin, in this connection, see Chapter 20. 12. J.D. Clark, 1970 c. page 204. 341. Methodology and African Prehistory. During the Neolithic was influenced by an earlier and more successful experiment in Southwest Asia. It was at this time that the continent was introduced to pastoralism. According to Clark, the first Neolithic pastoralists appear in the Sahara in the 5th millennium before our era, perhaps earlier. They drove herds of long and short-horned cattle and goats and flocks of sheep and continued there until the increasing desiccation after 2,500 years before our era forced some of them to move out. Pastoralism was, however, not diffused uniformly in all the environments of the continent. Whilst most communities came to own the smaller varieties of stock, only a few mastered the skill of tending the larger ones. The Mongps that Tuareg of the Sahara, the Fulani of the West African savanna and the Maasai of the East African grassland remained overwhelmingly committed to animal husbandry, and have eschewed any attempt at combining this skill with that of plant husbandry. Constantly following their herds in search of water and pasture, these communities have maintained till today the nomadic way of life in its purest form. Some Bantu groups in East Africa, however, have managed to combine animal husbandry with cultivation to the mutual advantage of both. Perhaps one of the factors inhibiting the spread of pastoralism in Africa was the proliferation of other zoological species which had a negative impact on resource development of the continent. Prominent among these is the tsetse fly. This large, bustling brown fly is the main, but not the only, vector of trypanosomiasis, a disease which causes sleeping sickness in MBN and spells death for his animals. This fly is found today in a belt running across Africa between latitudes I4 degrees N and S of the equator. The only exceptions are the islands rising to levels above I meter which are relatively cold, and the open short grass country where the dry season is too hot and desiccating for the fly to breed. Tsetse fly has been present in Africa since very remote times. Given the fact that fossil impressions of this fly have been found in the Miocene beds in North America, it would appear that the fly must have had a far wider distribution in prehistoric times. 3. Its disappearance from various areas in Africa and in parts of it may be the result of a combination of climatic changes, natural barriers and glaciation. Indeed, within Africa, the climatic alternations of the Pleistocene must have had a tremendous influence not only on the distribution of various species of the fly but also on their infection rates. Belts of land infested by these flies have constituted effective barriers to the development of animal husbandry. Herders must have realized at an early stage that their herds would face heavy losses when traveling through infested country. As such, the penetration of cattle from North Africa to the south was subject to the existence of natural fly-free corridors as well as those created by densely settled agricultural communities. So if the 13. T. D. K. Cockerell, 1907, 1909, 1919. 342. Historical geography, economic aspects. Latter, a good example is provided by the migration of cattle owners some 9 centuries ago creating, through the merging with other peoples, the Tutsi and Hutu society of present-day Rwanda and Burundi. The history of Africa would have been very different if the continent had been free of tsetse. Instead, with the fly effectively keeping large livestock out of the reach of settled agricultural communities, the use of such animals for draft purposes never occurred nor was opportunity created for discovering the great importance of the wheel. On the other hand, some of the larger livestock provided some peoples with riding animals whose fleetness of foot encouraged them into aggression and political domination of the sedentary peoples. 14. Other adverse zoological factors. We find the malarial mosquito and the locust. The several species of mosquito capable of transmitting malarial parasites of one kind or another, some are more attracted to human blood than others. The most prevalent in Africa is Anopheles gambiae which, because it also feeds on animals, is very difficult to eradicate as it can survive even if temporarily prevented from feeding on man. The mosquito usually breeds in standing water and is most numerous near swamps and rivers. Its breeding places increase with increasing rainfall, and high temperatures boost both the development of its larvae and that of the plasmodium cycle in the adult mosquito. By the same token, cooler temperatures encountered at higher altitudes curtail the incidence of the mosquito. Thus, endemic malaria tends to disappear above I meters even though transmission may persist beyond this level. How long the mosquito has been part of the human environment in Africa is not known. The very high incidence of the sickle cell trait found in many African populations would seem to suggest a long-standing and intimate relation between it and the evolution of the African populations. This trait is certainly the product of age-long selection pressure favoring the survival of these populations in conditions of hyperendemic malarial infections. The malarial mosquito, to the extent that it greatly impairs the survival chances of non-adapted human groups, has also been a major factor in the history of the continent. Certainly, until the 20th century, it effectively discouraged European settlement in the hot and humid climate of West Africa and saved the region from those thorny interracial problems that have plagued the history of the more elevated regions in North, East, Central and Southern Africa which had fallen victim to settler colonization. Locusts are amongst the traditional plagues of Africa. They are large grasshoppers living normally in single, solitary state or in small groups. They are found in areas of vegetational transition at the desert margins or near woodland and grassland savannas. 3 main kinds of locusts are found in Africa south of the Sahara. These are the red locust, the African migratory locust and the desert locust. All 3 need 2 kinds of habitat. 14. This may be seen in a role played by mounted warriors in the creation of African states, particularly north of the equator. 343. Methodology and African prehistory. Bare ground for laying their eggs and vegetated country for feeding. Occasionally when, for various reasons, their feeding ground is restricted to a small area they congregate into large swarms to invade areas far and near. Examples of such invasions are not easy to identify from the distant past, although the Old Testament does refer to the locust as one of the plagues from which Egypt suffered at the time of Moses. From about the 19th century records of invasions become more abundant. Central Africa, for instance, suffered invasions from the red locust at different times between 1847 and 1854, 1892 and 1910, and more recently between 1930 and 1944. For settled agricultural populations, the depredations of such invasions, especially just before harvest, can make all the difference between abundant food and famine. Where, in the past, other conditions such as drought coincided with locust invasion, the stage was set for considerable social and political upheaval on the continent. Water resources and human mobility. The significance of water resources in the evolving history of Africa can hardly be overestimated. Although the continent has within it areas with some of the highest annual rainfall figures in the world, it also has areas with some of the lowest. The extensive regions of the Sahara and the Kalahari are a standing testimony to the acute aridity of large parts of Africa. But besides the deserts, the broad savanna zone has only marginally adequate rainfall, and human lives in these regions depend greatly on the fluctuating vagaries of rain-bearing winds. This fact would not be a matter of serious concern if it were possible to exploit other sources of water such as surface streams, lakes and groundwater. However, over large parts of the continent, especially in the relatively hot, lowland regions, the river valleys are infested with debilitating insects and are therefore unsuitable for human settlement. The river regimes also closely parallel that of the rain and thus bring little relief in periods of rain failure or prolonged dry seasons when the riverbeds are themselves bare of water. Traditional technology except along the lower Nile Valley had no means of storing water against rainless days. Poorly developed technology also meant that groundwater could not be tapped below certain depths even in areas such as the artesian basins where the geological structures have helped to imprison vast reserves of water. In large parts of the continent underlain by basement complex rocks, little water storage capability is found and human settlement cannot depend on other than the annual rainfall. Water shortage resulting in serious drought conditions has thus always been a fact of life in Africa. The climatic history of the Pleistocene period shows that for different parts of the continent there is a widely cyclical pattern of long periods of more or less rainfall. But whatever the situation, drought represents an environmental pressure on human groups, forcing them to 344. Historical geography, economic aspects, respond in various ways. Characteristic of virtually all of these ways is the element of movement, a search for better watered areas either on a temporary or a permanent basis. Such human migratory movements can be peaceful but very often they tend to be aggressive, depending on their organization and their leadership. The histories of many communities in Africa record their migratory movements from one area to another, or the incursions of more powerful migrant groups who conquered and reorganized their societies. Where water is adequate, however, whether from rainfall or groundwater sources, and where the art of agriculture has been developed, a settled population grows up with the potentiality of gradual social evolution along the arduous road towards controlling nature. Rich and varied crops ripen and the rhythm of air maturation comes to dictate the rhythm of social life. The harvesting season becomes a special occasion and rituals are developed to give appreciative sanctity to an event that is inexplicable except in terms of a benign natural force. Whether this settled population rises higher in the ladder of social evolution depends on a number of other factors, not least of which is the abundance of food resources to encourage a division of labor within the community and facilitate the emergence of groups with specialized skills. This possibility depends not only on the adequacy of water supply but also on the fertility of the soils, soil resources and the social evolution of communities. To a large extent, the geological characteristics of large parts of Africa determine the quality of its soils. Because of the variety of rock types within the basement complex, the character of soils developed on this parent material is highly variable and their fertility is no more than moderate. Such rocks, however, tend on the whole to have an adequate reserve of most plant mineral nutrients, although their variability means that conditions may change rather sharply within a short distance. Soils developed on sedimentary rocks tend, on the other hand, to be more uniform in character over large areas, but they do not form anything approaching the wide tracts of highly productive soil as do the Chernozems of the wheatlands of the Ukraine or the prairies of North America. The interaction between soil characteristics and climatic factors has been crucial for soil fertility and its capacity to support dense population over the long run. In humid regions, for instance, the illusion of fertility produced by the luxuriant growth of vegetation hides the fragile nature of the soils. Once the natural vegetation is cleared, the organic matter in the soil rapidly disintegrates as a result of intensive bacterial action stimulated by the generally high temperatures. In no time, the fertility drops, crop yields diminish and the human population is constrained to shift elsewhere. In the subhumid regions, on the other hand, soil fertility is much better. However, the periodic oscillation and the pattern of movement of soil. 345. Methodology and African prehistory. Moisture encourages the development of extensive areas of lateritic ironstone crust which are completely unsuitable for cultivation. The presence of such crusty surfaces means that moderately fertile soils are scattered and their capacity for supporting dense human population greatly impaired. Such soil conditions are characteristic of Western Africa north of the forest zone and of the Central African plateaus at the margins of the Zaire Basin. In semi-arid lands with lower rainfall similar surfaces, known here as duricrusts, are also to be found, although their occurrence is more scattered. The result is that the brown sandy soils of this region are more valuable and in years of good rainfall give moderately good harvests. Further north, the desert soils are shallow, have poorly developed profiles and lack organic matter. A striking fact of the geography of Africa, therefore, is that really fertile soils are limited in extent and highly scattered in their distribution. They include the deep loamy clayey soils derived from basalts and other volcanic rocks of Pliocene and later ages which are found particularly in parts of East Africa. Under high forest, these soils are chocolate brown in color at high altitudes but red at lower levels. Of equal significance are the rich alluvial soils derived from the same type of rocks and found in the floodplains of rivers such as the Nile. The abundant yields of crops from both types of soils have facilitated the growth of dense human populations. Where, as in the Nile Valley, this concentration is combined with a high degree of social and environmental management such as was provided from the pre-dynastic Neolithic period, the stage is set for the emergence of a more highly evolved society. This later society with its growth of an urban civilization, its class differentiation, fine craftsmanship and monumental architecture as well as its use of writing, was the outcome not only of increasingly regular interaction with Mesopotamia but also of the possibility of supporting the dense population composed of a variety of social groups by an agricultural surplus which in those distant periods must have been very impressive. Such conditions were later to be reproduced in a few areas of Africa such as the bend of the Niger at the time of the emergence of the Ghana Empire in the early medieval period. But although there are other areas of fairly good soils, wide tracts of the continent, above all the upland plains where weathering has continued for millions of years, have soils that are thin, lack adequate plant nutrients or essential minerals, and are even today still of limited value for agriculture. In such areas, from as far back as the Neolithic, man has only succeeded in depending on shifting cultivation to eke out a living. This form of economy is profligate in its use of land and thus discourages the emergence of densely settled communities. The sparsity of population over large parts of Africa, with its inhibiting effect on social evolution, must thus be seen as a critical factor in its history. It is, of course, now known that the fertility of any area is as much a function of effective soil management as it is of natural characteristics. Indeed, other areas of the world where societies have today attained a higher level of social evolution. 346. Historical geography, economic aspects, have also passed through a phase of development in which their economy depended as much on shifting cultivation. For Africa, therefore, soil management constitutes a matter of vital importance for societal evolution. It was a determining factor in the past and points to the path that will have to be taken if a serious effort is to be made to embark on a process in which progress will be decisive. Conclusion: the historical geography of Africa, especially in its economic aspects, yields a picture of a continent in which nature has been unusually kind, at least on the surface. The superficiality of natural bounteousness, so well exemplified in the fragile luxuriance of the tropical forest, has been something of a trap for the human population in Africa. Finding existence so easy to achieve, communities have sidestepped the agonizing demands of social evolution. It is true that some far-sighted individuals or groups of individuals have emerged here and there to urge their communities forward, but their impact has failed to be cumulative. Then no doubt external interference, particularly the long history of slave raiding, has had a pernicious effect on the general state of development on the continent. But the fact that such interference was possible is a grim reminder of the dangers for any human group of failing to engage in the continuous struggle of fashioning stronger, larger and more cohesive social organizations to face possible challenges. The history of Africa will have availed us nothing if it does not strongly emphasize this fact. As in the prehistoric period, the geography of Africa today reveals a continent with still abundant natural resources. Its recent colonial past has, however, helped to create a situation where much of these resources are exploited largely as exportable raw materials to serve the needs of other societies. Moreover, exploitation with its high technological requirements demands the organization of the African peoples in large integrated communities to develop these resources for genuine development. The history of a decade of political independence of African countries leaves an ambiguous impression that the importance of fashioning such communities in competition with other similar communities is still far from being grasped. The purpose of this sketch of a historical, economic geography of the continent, if it serves any purpose at all, should be to stress that nature in Africa, as elsewhere, determines neither the destiny of a people nor the route it will take. Its role is at best permissive. Peoples, like individuals, have been and will continue to be the architects of their own fortunes. 347. The interdisciplinary methods adopted in this study. J. KCRBO. Introduction. The interdisciplinary approach to historical research is a fashionable idea. But when it comes to putting it into practice, difficulties arise. There are great differences in method of work between different disciplines, and research workers are deeply imbued with the habit of specialization, and jealous of the territorial integrity of their own subjects. The same tendency appears even in presenting the results of research. The life of a community is still dealt with under quite separate headings covering, for example, economic, social and cultural aspects. The suggestion of interdisciplinary working is thought of in terms of takeover bids. In this struggle for territory and leadership, history is in an ambivalent position. It is essential to all disciplines, but having unlike other subjects no esoteric vocabulary of its own for its practitioners to take refuge behind, it runs the risk of becoming devalued, acquiring universality, as it were, at the cost of respectability. If history is an orchestra, its conductor has traditionally been the written record. But the history of Africa, particularly south of the Sahara, is characterized by a relative dearth of written sources, especially before the 16th and even more before the 7th century of our era. There is an African proverb which says, "When your mother is not there, you suck your grandmother." One failing written source material, African history must combine all other available sources in order to recreate the past. The deficiency may in the last analysis become something of an advantage. It makes possible an escape from the overriding influence of the written word and the consequent implicit devaluation of other sources. Historical and anthropological research in Africa has long suffered from two contradictory evils. One is the weakness of historians for regarding the process of social change as a mere string of dates. Hence the obsessional urge to construct a chronology that will make human development intelligible, to the neglect of everything else, economics, social structure and culture. Lactation appears to be a reflex process, but the African pharmacopoeia included recipes for making grandmothers lactate. The interdisciplinary methods adopted in this study. Hence the linear approach aimed at producing a genealogy or a succession of events, the bare bones of history, in short, without the flesh and blood. The other even more pernicious aberration may come partly from applying to the real African preconceived ideas of the primitive condition drawn from sketchy concepts of evolution. It analyses structures as though they were timeless, disregarding the historical depth which alone gives them meaning, subjective or objective. Again, some scholars are taken with the notion of the self-sufficiency of their own subjects. There are linguists allergic to any suggestion of cultural interaction, and functionalist anthropologists reject the idea of historical depth. Happily, watertight compartments of this sort are being progressively broken down. The realization, writes J. Desmond Clark, that archaeologists, linguists and cultural anthropologists or ethnographers are faced with many of the same problems and that the best way of solving them is by interdisciplinary teamwork, is one of the most encouraging and exciting factors in African studies today. The pseudo-history characterized by an exclusive preoccupation with chronology, and the delusion of a purely static, formal structural analysis, are on the wane. This is demonstrated by those schools of thought which are introducing diachrony and conflict into their methods of work, either integrating cultural data with linguistic data, for example, Calling all and Hoes or abandoning the sociologist's static approach for a dynamic one that takes movement and comparison as its tools balance the earth. Contradiction is, after all, an integral part of reality. What is certain is that no single discipline can tackle alone the dense jungle of the reality of Africa. The Gordian knot is not to be sliced through with a cutlass. Some workers claim to have found the essential explanation of a particular African society in a single factor, for example, in the structural analysis of kinship, or in the complex of representations, beliefs, myths and symbols considered as a logical entity in itself, independent, for instance, of productive relations. 3. In fact, a study of kinship shows us systems less pure and more complex in Africa than, say, in Australia, with structures which Levi-Strauss admits are conditioned by economic and political factors as well as the mere mechanism of kinship rules. African history is less well equipped than any other subject to thrive in a vacuum, even indeed, especially when it comes to what might be regarded as history's special preserve, establishing the chronology. The correct solution to a problem of chronology often calls for the use of 4 different sources: written records, archaeology, linguistics and oral tradition. Thus the historian following time backwards is like a motorist with several instruments at his disposal for measuring distances: his mileometer, his 2. J.D. Clark, 1970. 3. C.M. Cryall and G. Dieterlen, 1965. 349. Methodology and African Prehistory. Watch, a Milestones and, conceivably, information from a local inhabitant. This essential cooperation helps to ensure that the picture of the past is recreated with a clarity and completeness that no one source alone could give. The description of Kombi given by Albacken would still be sadly incomplete were it not for the mass of supplementary information furnished by archaeological excavation. Even oral tradition made its contribution here, leading as it did to the discovery of the site of Kombi. Hence it seems inappropriate to classify sources in order of importance, with written records at the top and oral tradition at the bottom. The value of a source is not absolute, but varies according to the subject of research. In any given case the mass of available data will include the master source, which will vary according to the topic. For African prehistory or for pygmy societies, written records obviously not the best source, there are none. For different periods and areas the range of historical evidence is dominated by different master sources, the others playing subsidiary roles. The master source is not the same for an obscure Pietrilite and tribe, Jugurthis Kingdom, the Kurdi of northern Cameroon, the Asandi of Ghana, the Kabra of northern Togo and the GHA Empire described in the Urjit al-Fattash. Moreover, it may well be that the master source will be identified only after the research is complete, for though the source conditions the results, it is the results that vindicate the source. So it is safe to say that in the field of African history the interdisciplinary approach, far from being a luxury, is one of the essential factors. There is in fact no alternative to it. HOW sources complement one another. The sources of African history are manifestly complementary. Any single one on its own will be defective and give a blurred image of reality which can only be brought into sharp focus by means of other sources. Archaeology by itself may yield little more than a dry as dust description or a sterile conclusion incautiously arrived at on the basis of a small number of samples, and if waiting for further excavations were the only way of confirming or exploding hypotheses, the pace of progress would become intolerably slow. But replaced in the many-faceted living context which it is its purpose to explore, archaeology does much for other disciplines and receives much from them in return. Finds are often explained from outside archaeology, as at Zimbabwe, where it is the gold mines and their defense, plus religion, that make sense of most of the structures above and below ground level. Grave goods, and the positioning of bodies in tombs, can be explained only in terms of a people's beliefs and its ideas of the hereafter. Conversely, when excavation in northern Ghana brings to light architectural features identical with those of the Sudanese Sahel, archaeology sets or solves an interesting problem of cultural influence. African art, again, can only illuminate history if it is illuminated by it. Art. 350. The interdisciplinary methods adopted in this study, and particularly prehistoric art, is conditioned by a multiplicity of factors, from geology through social and political structure and kingly ambition to religion, mythology and cosmogony. Aesthetics is closely governed by ethics, while at the same time serving it. Moreover, by recording ritual, scorifications, hairstyles, costumes and scenarios, art often acts as a museum of social and even physical anthropology. Art defined as craft plus inspiration cannot be understood without history. Social organization often explains points of style. For instance, that Benin the same artists savant carve wood and ivory, while others work in pottery and bronze. The manufacture of ivory and bronze objects is in large part explained by a switch from one material to the other, just as the outline and external decoration of pots from prehistoric periods is only to be explained by their descent from plated straw baskets. Then there are masks, on the making of which Africans have lavished such boundless imagination. Babo masks, for instance, especially the three main types, Kili ancestor masked in the head of marabou crane and Tibal buffalo skull are real personalities, familiar in the village. They are not only evidence of history, but contribute actively to the making of it. For The cowries described by Ibn Battuta in 1352 at the court of Mali were originally intended for use as coinage, but they also served as adornments, artistically strung together, and were specially important on social occasions and at religious ceremonies. Here art is an integral part of a whole complex pattern which gives it meaning and which at the same time it endows with life. To embark on the history of certain African societies without a knowledge of the rich language of cowries and masks would be like going into a library without being able to read. It would inevitably produce a defective version of their evolution. The same is true of oral tradition, which is discussed at length elsewhere. Oral tradition is history from life and transmitted by the collective memory, with all the garbling and lack of sophistication that this entails, but also all the freshness and vigor. Certainly it has its flaws. For example, it is often silent about economic and social factors. But even with its flaws it can point us to other sources which are often more relevant, such as manuscripts or archaeological sites. Indeed, before embarking on any program of excavations it is wise to set to work to collect oral traditions. It is also to help in correcting errors of interpretation that may arise from a purely external approach, and it makes it possible to limit the number of hypotheses. For the great oracle mask or spirit of God is Goge, and is guarded by a high priest called Aganola. The great mask plays an important part in the political system of these societies, which is virtually an extension of ancestor worship, operating at night in the closest secrecy. For meetings of the Paro the great mask is brought to the sacred wood beforehand, covered with a white cloth. The Ganola acts as headman and priest, and dispenser of ancestors' sanctified truth. Goge is also a legislator. Its decisions are promulgated in the village and have the force of law. Translated from M. Hoey's in Etudes Gibbons, 1951. G. W. Harley, 1950. 351. Methodology and African Prehistory. To narrow the spectrum of alternatives. 5. Where there are several versions of the same tradition, some other source, e.g., reference to a map showing the areas affected by an eclipse, will make it possible to decide between them. Drums, which have their roots in tradition, are one of Africa's great living books. Some drums are oracles, others are broadcasting stations, war cries inciting to heroism, or chroniclers recording landmarks in the life of the community. Their language is essentially a message replete with history. In this connection some divide ethnomusicology into internal, technical musicology and external musicology, which is part of the social and cultural fabric. 6. The greatest epics and chronicles are often sung by groups organized for the purpose, and in the manner peculiar to Africa, in which the whole audience join, for music is never passively listened to, but it is performed by everyone. Who is present. What is happening is a collective celebration. The song, dance and music become a synthesis to which linguistics, history, botany, psychology, social psychology, physiology, psychoanalysis, religion, etc., may all contribute. Without exaggerating the importance of musicochronology, the comparative study of music and musical instruments by arithmetical means and statistical analysis can provide clinching evidence on the question of the spread and development of cultures. The world of African music is giving ground in the face of an invasion by other types of music, often less rich even if introduced by richer economic systems. is the drum that has made history destined to end up in the near future itself as a museum exhibit. Linguistics is becoming more and more the partner of history, and a young, reliable, productive partner it is. For languages are a living museum in which tradition is preserved, and to extract the real essence of them it is necessary to possess the science of language. Every language is both a psychological entity and a social phenomenon. Its vocabulary, for instance, reflects the impact of history on a people. But conversely it is the language, the word, that instills a system of concepts and behavioral rules into a people's mentality and motivations. Some concepts are difficult to express properly in a language geared to a different overall context, as for instance that of Seneca in Monde or Rakier in Mole, roughly translatable as joking relationship, which plays such an important historical role in the 5. Obviously oral tradition must be placed in context. An interesting tabular analysis of tales and legends sets out in 9 columns data internal to the tale, e.g. semantic and stylistic and external data, some within the context of culture and civilization and some outside it. See Literature Arabo-Berberi, for e-Bulletin de Liaison, 1970, Centre d'études maghrébines, Musée de Lyon, Paris. 6. Working on these lines, it is possible to advance into many more specialized areas, such as the relationship between music and speech, the social and philosophical symbolism attaching to music, the links between rhythm and possession phenomena, the relationship between music and economic and ecological environment, and the relationship between the musics of different ethnic groups. Simha N.D. Constant indeed. Martin and T. Yiannopoulos, 1973. 352. The interdisciplinary methods adopted in this study. Sudan and Sahel, or that Oigui in Monde, which by no means coincides with the simple notion of landlord, or Oiteksoba, rendered literally master of the land or earth priest, though these do not convey the meaning. The GHA historian will be continually using linguistic evidence along with other source material. Thus for instance the date and origin of the circular ruins in the Lobi area were determined by the conjunction of several pieces of mutually conflicting and supporting evidence. A hypothetical Portuguese origin, based on a text by D. Barros, was ruled out by the line of the road supposedly used and by examination of the pebble dash coating, which turned out to be too fresh to justify an early dating. Then the Wheelai and Birat name for these ruins. Kolnawo or stables for foreigners' cows, was noted. The foreigners were identified as the Kalongos on the strength of the style of pottery found in the ruins, and finally an estimate of date was made taking into account the migration traditions of the peoples of the area. This is a practical demonstration of the decisive role of linguistics in interpreting a particular historical fact. 7. It would be a great mistake to confuse the phenomenon of language, which is cultural, with tribalism or the biological factor of race. The GHA language of the Dagorba horsemen who invaded the Volta Basin in the 14th century is probably lost, having been supplanted by that of the local Kursace women whom they took as their wives and who became the mothers of their children. Here we see an example of linguistic contamination at the expense, as sometimes happens, of the political ruling class. Ethnohistory, in the shape of the quasi-static ethnographic present of the functionalist anthropologists, is not real history. It has nothing to contribute to our team of sources, each of which is not static but a variable carried along by the tide of history. Besides, functionalist ethnohistory too often ignores material cultures and that general movement of produce which Leroy Gorhan described as the matrix of civilization. Barter trade across the Sahara, on the basis of salt for gold from the Sudan, superseded some centuries later by that of slaves for guns, may well have been the main factor underlying the rise of the kingdoms and empires of West Africa. Thus we see that a dynamic sociology must also form one of the principal strands in African historical research. It is not a matter of blindly shifting one's effort from one socio-political work phase to another, either in time or space. That would create more problems than it solved. For instance, to calculate the average length of reign, it will not do simply to extrapolate backwards from an average length established for a known contemporary period. The political and social stability or instability are not necessarily the same. Again, the preferential collateral succession, from brother to brother, in the Musi kingdom of Yatega would not produce the same average values as in the kingdom of Ouagadougou, where succession was preferentially in the direct line from father to son. In the case of Ouagadougou, the